When the world came together to condemn the war in Gaza, Canada was the only country to oppose it. Israel's ambassador says he is concerned that the growing number of Muslim Canadians might cause a shift in this country's Middle Eastern policy. Is he afraid the average Canadian will finally know the truth?
Fisk, renowned writer and commentator on Middle Eastern affairs for the UK newspaper The Independent, had lots of experience.
The issue is that the Palestinians of Gaza, and this is the real story, do not come from Gaza. The Palestinians of Gaza come from that part of Palestine that became Israel. And the place where the rockets, the Hamas pathetic rockets, are falling are the lands which were owned by the people who now live in Gaza. And this is the story which you and Al Jazeera tell, but which the Western media do not tell.
After the fall of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, control of Palestine shifted from Muslim to Western powers. In return for their help in the war, Britain had promised autonomy to both Zionists and Arabs. Land east of the Jordan River became the Emirate of Transjordan. Land to the west, from Lebanon and Syria in the north to Egypt in the south, remained Palestine. Finally, on November 29, 1947, the United Nations passed Resolution 181, which called for a partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. The Jews accepted the resolution, but the Arabs opposed it. Knowing that the UN had just divided a territory that was overwhelmingly populated by Arabs and had given more than half of it, 55% of it, to a minority group. The Zionists possessed the rudiments of a government in form of the Jewish Agency and the National Council and a well-organized militia known as the Haganah. Zionist leaders had long recognized that the new Jewish state would have a significant Arab population, and they worried about the so-called demographic problem. That is, the possibility that Arabs would come to outnumber the Jews in the new state. Early Zionist leaders such as David Ben-Gurion argued that compulsory transfer might be necessary and that he saw nothing morally wrong with it. From March 1948 to May 1948, Haganah forces occupied about 200 Arab villages and expelled their inhabitants. On May 14, 1948, the British mandate was terminated, and at midnight, the Jewish state of Israel declared its independence. In the War of 1948-1949 between Arabs and Israel, Israel had numerical superiority throughout the war and by its final stages outnumbered Arab troops by 2-1. After the war, Israel increased the land under its control far beyond what it had been given by the partition plan, from 55% to 79% of what had been Palestine. By the end of 1948, more than 500 Palestinian Arab villages had been destroyed and Arab neighborhoods in nearly a dozen cities had been ethnically cleansed. Thousands of Palestinians were massacred in ethnic cleansing operations, often as retribution for Israeli casualties during the war. In the War of 1967, history has witnessed that Israeli struck first and caught the Arab countries by surprise. In the Six-Day War that followed, Israel demolished the armies and air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. It also gained control of the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights region of southwestern Syria, and all of Jerusalem. Since 1967, there have been many efforts toward peace, but peace has remained elusive in the region. Palestinians have been forced out of their rightful lands and have been struggling to live a dignified life in Gaza, which is essentially a long-term refugee camp. In November 2007, the International Committee of the Red Cross report called Dignity Denied in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. As highlighted in the report, Palestinians face hardship in their daily lives. They are prevented from doing what makes up the daily fabric of most people's existence. They face a deep human crisis, where millions of people are denied human dignity, not once in a while, but every day, and the people of Gaza are trapped and sealed off. The humanitarian cost is enormous, and people can barely survive. Families unable to get enough food increased by 14%, and Palestinians are being trampled underfoot day after day. In Gaza, under siege, Palestinians continue to pay for conflict and economic constraints with their health and livelihoods. Cutting power and fuel further compounds their hardship. The volatile situation erupted in September with the outbreak of a second Intifada uprising. It was known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada because it was triggered by a decision by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to permit an archaeological excavation near a Muslim holy site, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. In response, Palestinian militants resumed widespread resistance to Israel and the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And then for a short time there was relative peace, when both Hamas and Israel called for a ceasefire, resulting from an agreement that Hamas would stop the rocket attacks if Israel removed border blockades. Hamas held up its end of the deal. Israel, however, did not uphold its part by ending the border blockades. According to some observers, this was due to the upcoming U.S. presidential elections. Israel was running out of time to devastate Hamas. Rocket attacks resumed from Gaza, although they were inaccurate Quasam rockets that caused little damage and few casualties. Israel responded forcefully in late December with massive airstrikes that struck a number of government buildings, mosques, schools, and other facilities that caused significant civilian casualties.
Time now for our international press review. James Creedon's here. James, I imagine Gaza once again filling most of the papers.
Yeah, can't get away from it, and the tone really is one of indignation and puzzlement this morning in a lot of the papers. Even though I tried to bring a sort of a balanced view, really the tone is quite negative regarding Israel. Have a look at this headline in The Independent. Quite simply, why? And that, of course, is referring to the bombing of a UN school in Jabalia, 40 dead refugees. Inside, Robert Fisk, the veteran Middle East journalist, calls the massacre a war crime. And he says what's amazing really about this story is how many Western presidents, prime ministers, editors, journalists buy the Israeli line that they take great care to avoid civilian casualties. As far as he can see, that isn't the case, and he lists...
So Fisk completely rubbishing this idea that Israel was being fired at by people from within the school.
He's saying that is, whether or not that is the case, that they're not taking care to avoid civilian casualties, and he lists out a whole load of civilian massacres, that's his words, not mine,
Sure.
in recent years.
Sure.
And he says really that any president and prime minister who failed to call for a ceasefire in the last couple of days has the blood of last night's butchery on their hands.
So he's talking
really,
about Bush, basically.
Bush, he's saying George Bush, really. If he'd called for a ceasefire 48 hours earlier, those 40 civilians would be alive, he said.
Okay.
Now, in The Guardian, we have another article which is very critical by an Oxford professor of international relations and a former Israeli army member. He said he never questioned the legitimacy of the Israeli state within its 1967 borders. But what he objects to hugely is this expansionist project by Israel. He said even though they withdrew 8,000 settlers in 2005 from the Gaza Strip, a year later they put 12,000 settlers into the West Bank. So he said they've chosen land over peace.
And this man quoted The Guardian, you say is actually a former member of the Israeli army.
He's a former member of the Israeli army. He's an Israeli, he's a Jew, and he's a professor at Oxford in international relations. And he said that these actions of the last 4 decades make it very difficult to conclude anything other than the fact that Israel is behaving as a rogue state. And he says the characteristics of a rogue state: they violate international law, they possess weapons of mass destruction and practice terrorism, which he says is using violence against civilians for political ends. He says the cap fits. Israel must...
We're here with one very simple message today, and that is demanding a free Palestine. End the siege of Gaza now! End the siege of Gaza now!
You cited many pro-Palestinian protests here. A branch of Hasidic Jews who oppose Zionism joined the anti-Israeli protesters to tell their Jewish brothers inside the embassy what Israel is doing in Gaza is simply wrong.
We're coming to show our sympathy and that our hearts are rent by what is happening to the people in Gaza and throughout Palestine, and we want the world to hear this and understand it's not a religious conflict. It's simply taking the rights, the human rights, which is godly rights from these people, wrongly, illegally, and against God.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. We are all standing out here to condemn this genocide, what's happening now in Gaza.
The Geneva Treaty of 1980, CCW, Protocol 3. White phosphorus should not be used as a weapon in civilian areas. Israel claims that it used white phosphorus for making smoke curtains for their troops and to light the darkness in Gaza.